foreseeable future. This does tend to happen when one has a break from school, so I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to making more videos and seeing your fine suggestions down in the comments below. I hope that you enjoy this video, and please continue to subscribe and write it in the comments section for your favorite topics. It's been now about 2 months, more or less, since Ukraine drastically reduced offensive operations at Kyiv and Bakhmut. It is now December, which means that we can safely conclude that Ukraine's much-typed summer offensive is over, and unfortunately we can also conclude that it has failed to achieve in its main objectives, which leaves us to assess what went wrong and how those failures can be corrected for future offensives in 2025 and possibly even 2026. What am I talking about? So like usual, we'll start with some context and some recap, then we'll progress to the Russian defenses, in which we now understand much better than we did back in May or June. And after that, we'll discuss why the offensive failed to achieve its main objectives, some of the notable weaknesses that it revealed in Ukraine's forces and force structure, some of the lessons that can be learned, and the ways in which Ukraine's weaknesses can ultimately be remedied in preparation for any future offensive operations that may be happening. So first off, we'll start with a little bit of background, right? So the front line as of June 4th, 2023, the day in which the offensive began in the Velika Novosilka sector. Bakhmut's battle is over. Russia has won. But Wagner has been absolutely gutted by this town. It was so gutted that it was unfit for further operations, leading to a drastic drop-off in the intensity of the fighting in this sector. This freed up Ukrainian resources, especially large numbers of artillery shells, for the offensive. Additionally, the mud had finally dried, and so Ukrainian preparatory operations had now come to a close. These preparatory operations had included raids into Russia itself, as well as missile strikes in Crimea in the south. They had been going on for some months, and they were now as successful as they were possibly going to be. With Russia temporarily pausing operations after the losses around Bakhmut, the way was clear for Ukraine to attack. So Zaluzhny made the call, and the army of Zaporizhzhia was told to commence immediate offensive operations. This was more consequential than many people may think, the decision to attack in Zaporizhzhia. Ukraine had a choice between Zaporizhzhia in the south and Luhansk in the northwest. An attack in Luhansk, as symbolized by the black arrow up there on the screen, is more likely to succeed because the Russian defenses were not as formidable. A success would win back territory. It would win back most likely a good portion of everything, possibly even north of the red line. But it would not fundamentally change the war. An attack in Zaporizhzhia, meanwhile, symbolized by the second black arrow there, would be a meaningful, decisive victory that could potentially change the war. It would pierce the toughest Russian defenses, it would drive to the sea, it would cut the Russians in two, and would possibly even force the surrender of all of Crimea, Kherson, and western Zaporizhzhia. It would be a decisive Ukrainian victory that would demonstrate Ukraine's ability to expel Russia from all of its territory, or it would be if it succeeded. So Ukraine picked the high-risk but high-reward option. Now, Russia was quite aware of the stakes, just as well as Ukraine, and they understood what losing a potential decisive battle would mean. So under their former commander, Sergei Shoigu, they began the construction of the defenses that would come to be known as the Surovikin Line. This line was continued and strengthened after Surovikin's dismissal, and only now, in December, do we really understand what Ukraine's units were up against. It was initially assumed that the Surovikin Line was 3 main lines of defense. As we can see on the map from the excellent Institute for Study of War, we can see a preliminary line here, a secondary line further south, and then a third line even further south between Tokmak and Melishivka before Melitopol itself, So it was assumed that the Surovikin line was made up of about 3 main lines of defense, each line about 6 miles apart, each line predominantly marked by anti-tank obstacles. In between the main lines were secondary defensive positions that were intended to wear down Ukrainian strength and stop the attack cold. You can see that we have set preliminary defensive positions out here. In front of Robotne, we have other positions between some of the 2 main lines right here on the map. The idea was that Ukraine would find itself gradually worn down as it advanced through the first 2 lines, and it would be stopped cold by the 3rd line, at which point a gigantic counterattack would throw Ukraine back to its starting lines. We can see what the Russian trenches look like by looking at this example. This example is from Crimea, but it shows us a good example of what each of the main Russian trench lines were thought to consist of. Imagine this, but spread across the entire front. This analysis did not fully grasp Russian intentions. Russia did not plan to defend in depth, but to stop Ukraine cold at its start lines from the beginning. The Surovikin main line was not 3 main lines with secondary positions in between. It was a 20-mile wide single main line. What we've seen as secondary positions were in reality massive strongpoints that look like something from World War I. The image up here on the top left is an image of the German trenches in World War I in the Somme sector, and this gives us a rather good idea of what the Russians had in mind. The difference, of course, is that while this image covers, ground of 800 meters to a mile, the Russian positions would have continued in this exact linear fashion, three main lines of defense, a secondary line, communication trenches, and then the repetition of the whole thing. Russian defenses continued like this for nearly 20 miles. And this first image gives us a good idea of the Russian defense scheme. It shows a Russian trench situated along a tree line and backed by flanking fire from alongside this road. It looks like a strong position, but one that can nonetheless be taken by artillery bombardment and a strong, determined mechanized assault. The second image on the bottom is after weeks of artillery fire against these positions have stripped away all the foliage. It reveals that the tree line trench is merely the leading edge of an entire network centered around the village of Mykolivka, which is back here. There are tunnels to bring up supplies. There are positions located between the former trees and the village. There are tunnels crossing under the road right here. We can see how the tunnel network extends all the way back and then left following the Mykosa. And we can see that the whole thing is completely interconnected and offers no easy flank to turn, making Ukraine attack all of this directly head on. Once the village is taken, we can see that there are more roads and trees in the background, which, as you guessed it, is the leading edge of an entire new network. All of this goes on for about 20 miles, and let's not forget, in all of this, that there are mines by the absolute million. Mines have proven so important that I felt it necessary to spend an entire slide talking about them. So the ground in front of each trench network is full of mines. Ukraine has had experience with Russian minefields in the Kherson campaign. This was not fun. It was rather like, in fact, seeing your ex. But even veterans from Kherson were completely stunned by the minefields that the Russians laid out for Zaporizhzhia. From the Kherson experience, Ukraine expected Russian minefields to be 125 meters wide and dense enough so that the average infantryman should cover about 3 to 4 mines as they crossed it. Instead, the minefields were 500 meters wide and so dense at a density of over 1 mine per square meter that the average infantryman would encounter 550 mines as he crossed it. This image shows us a good idea of what the Ukrainians were operating on the assumption of, but in reality, you can imagine this distance, but about 5 to 6 times as many black dots. Each black dot, of course, representing a mine. Anytime Ukraine brought up minefield clearing equipment, which had been supplied by the West, the Russians understood this to be a key target and locked onto it with everything they had, quickly destroying much of it. This then limited the advance to the rate of the infantrymen probing the ground with the bayonet to find mines and clear them by hand, one by one, while the Russians fired at him all the time. In the face of such obstacles, the surprising thing is not that the advance failed. The surprising thing is that Ukraine got as far as it did with as few casualties as it did. Thankfully, casualties were heavy, but they were not some sort of Pickett's charge scenario in which all the tanks ended up destroyed and all the men ended up dead. Thank goodness. The units that were committed to this offensive were fresh new units. They had been newly raised with only 5 to 6 weeks of training. This sort of thing seriously affects offensive combat power. If you practice something that's not easy for you, you're probably not going to get it the first few times, and that's also true for combat. So what does that look like? The troops are still figuring out how to use their heavy weapons, their machine guns, their mortars, their portable SAMs. The troops don't know each other that well, which means they don't have the unit cohesion that allows them to know how each one reacts under pressure. Different platoons in the same company haven't been able to practice working together. And most crucially, the officers don't know their men that well, and the officers also haven't got much practice in leading. All of that means that when they go into battle, they're going to make mistakes because they're still raw. And in battle, mistakes usually mean that you end up dead. Just to drive home the challenge faced by these units, in World War II, the U.S. 29th Division, which was given the job of leading the way at Omaha Beach, it had 2 years of training for that single specific mission. It still took 30% casualties on D-Day. Under the circumstances, the fact that Ukraine advanced 6 miles and did not carpet the ground with its dead is a remarkable achievement. Now that we've covered the fighting and the obstacles Ukraine faced, let's turn to lessons learned. First, and most importantly, Ukraine's strength and weakness is summed up well by a comment that a certain Virginian commander once made of his force. There never were such men, not in any army before, and there will not be again. If properly led, they will go anywhere and never falter at the task before them. The problem comes with the clause that says, if properly led. Here Ukraine must improve. By leadership, I'd like to clarify that I don't mean Zelensky or Zaluzhny. They are fine. I mean officers from the platoon level to brigade level. Too many still have the old Soviet mindset of doing things. One classic example was brought up by RUSI, or Royal United Study Institute. They pointed out that in many counterattacks, then smoke grenades have been helpful at confusing the Russians and therefore allowing Ukrainian successes. But when the counteroffensive began, many brigade commanders refused to use smoke grenades. The smoke blinds them from monitoring the attack. Well, why should the brigade commanders want to monitor their attack? Because when they were left on their own to lead the attack, the platoon and company commanders hadn't noticed crucial Russian counter moves, which led, of course, to things failing. So Ukraine needs better platoon and company commanders that don't make those kinds of mistakes, but it also needs better brigade commanders who trust their subordinates to take the given objectives without constant monitoring. The second lesson is that Ukraine must improve its force generation, structure, and training. I again am heavily indebted to RUSI for these particular examples. So, a Ukrainian infantry brigade is supposed to have 27 platoons of infantry, and indeed many have that or more. But of those 27, on average, only 6 are actually capable of leading the assault. This is because leading the assault demands that units operate as teams, not as collections of individuals. They must operate as units. For example, one squad lays down covering fire, one squad advances frontally to keep the Russians pinned down, and one squad flanks the Russians out. This is not 27 infantrymen doing their own thing. This is 3 assault teams of one platoon, all executing according to a prearranged plan that will likely give success. The plan is simple, but is prearranged. Everyone knows where he should be and how he should be doing it. But this sort of thing takes a lot of practice, and it can't be done without training as a unit how to do it. But Ukraine doesn't have time to train units. It can and does train individuals, but then those units are then sent to the front to replace casualties. Once they arrive at the front, the brigade commanders on the line are supposed to actually do unit training. But there is an obvious problem with this, namely that the brigades are on the line, meaning they are engaged in active combat operations. So necessarily, the units that can be trained by each brigade are limited, because when the Russians are attacking, it turns out that you really can't send away a third of your men off at a time to train them in larger unit operations. You can only spare a platoon or so here or there at times when the front line isn't that intense. And this is why platoons only have 6, platoons to conduct assaults. 6 platoons is just 150 men. It's not enough to lead a big major attack. And this is why this summer's big attack failed. Because on paper it was a big attack, but in the field it just wasn't. It was a bunch of small pinprick attacks that completely lacked the required mass and size to break through. So how are we going to address this? The answer is that the Ukrainian army must expand. Now, I know that sounds completely counterintuitive, okay? The Ukrainian army is over 500,000 men. You possibly must be saying that there is no way they need to expand. But the answer is yes. The Army gets new men almost entirely via the draft, and conscription numbers are currently based on casualty numbers. Each week, casualties for the next 6 weeks are estimated, and then the appropriate number of men are conscripted to replace them. The draftees are then given basic training and sent to the front line to replace casualties. This approach ensures that units are always at an acceptable strength, and it limits the number of men conscripted. It thus limits the additional impact of war on families and society that are already very heavily impacted. This is all to the good. The problem with the system, though, is that it doesn't allow for new units to be created. So as painful as it is going to be, Ukraine must draft more men on top of those required for casualty replacement. Conscription must exceed losses. It cannot just keep up with losses. The new men must then be used to form new units which can be trained in the assault tactics. Additionally, training by the West must focus not on the individual, as this duplicates an existing Ukrainian capability. It must focus on the unit instead, because Ukraine cannot currently offer this capability at scale, whereas the West, not engaged in active war, most certainly can. So now moving on to more lessons learned. The next takeaway from this summer is to counter Russian strength. The defense is naturally superior to the offensive, and so in any war, the strengths of the defenders must be removed before a successful attack is made. Russian defensive strengths include seemingly limitless minefields, massive artillery support, helicopters with long-range anti-tank missiles that can destroy tanks from outside a range at which the tanks can respond, fighters launching glide bombs, large numbers of drones, and electronic warfare, which is very capable at taking down Ukraine's own drones. That's a problem, as drones are Ukraine's main mechanism of air support. Some of these advantages are easier to counter than others. Attack aircraft and fighters can be countered by aircraft with long-range air-to-air missiles. This perfectly describes F-16s, which will be in Ukraine certainly by 2025. Helicopters and fighters can also be destroyed at their bases by ATACMS missiles. Ukraine has already used these against helicopter bases with great success, but it needs more missiles to be able to permanently shut down Russian aviation. Artillery support can be countered by more Western-provided artillery pieces and more ammunition for them. Minefields can be countered by an exceptionally large number of new mine-clearing systems. We'll have to make new ones and send them to Ukraine because we don't have the required numbers in stock. But we know what's required and we know how to make it. We just require the political will to make producing and shipping a top priority. The advantage that's most difficult to address is Russian electronic warfare. But one solution is to use HIMARS warheads with a home-on EW capability. This may sound like science fiction, but it isn't. We already have missiles which home in on enemy radar emissions and jamming. We just need to produce HIMARS warheads which have those exact capabilities. And that'll be difficult since they don't exist, and it'll take longer. We need to build a prototype and then test it and then scale up production and then produce one hell of a lot of them. But that's the kind of creativity that Ukraine and the West are going to require to succeed. I'd like to reiterate again that the means, the factory capacity, the money, the training expertise, they exist and can be given to Ukraine to allow it to mount a stepwise attack. What does that look like? Ukraine would first destroy Russian air power, then it would destroy Russian electronic warfare so Ukraine's own drones can support the ground troops. Ukraine's drones will then destroy Russian tanks and machine guns that shoot back at Ukraine. Artillery bombardment will destroy Russian artillery and provide cover. Mine clearing will remove Russian minefields. Attacks will be made on a battalion or brigade scale to punch wide gaps in the Russian lines, allowing the secondary forces in reserve to come up and keep up the pressure, ideally making gains measured in kilometers at a time, not meters. The attacks will be coordinated with Ukrainian electronic warfare to knock out Russian drones. I am aware that this summons up comparisons with Iraq and Afghanistan. Because in Iraq and Afghanistan, the approach was that if the local troops don't succeed, then don't admit the local troops have problems, just throw in more money. But this is not either of those countries. The useful test to determine if this is a useful intervention to support is, are the locals more dedicated to their country than we are? This was not the case in Afghanistan, where we cared more about the locals than the Western-style government than we created. But we imposed nothing on Ukraine. They care about their country more than we do, and this tells us that things are different than our adventures in the Middle East. But all of this requires political will, and even with political will, which is uncertain, it will require time. And so it's time that I'd like to talk about, because nobody who follows this war is unaware that it will be decided, in the end, by how much Western political will there is to support Kyiv. I understand that time is the argument that the one thing the Ukrainians do not have, that Ukraine must make gains to ensure more Western support. But this is my question. If Ukraine attacks again, and it loses because it goes in prematurely, will that generate more or less Western support? To be cynical, as long as Ukraine is preparing for another offensive, Ukraine's advocates can delay an end to the war. They can say, give Ukraine another chance. But if Ukraine attacks for a second time and loses, that will likely be the end of that. And we should not make a mistake. Ukraine is not ready right now to attack again. Its soldiers might have truth and justice and righteousness all on their side, but those aren't going to clear any minefields, nor will they make up for a lack of training. There has been an offensive, and it has failed. But what we have seen is what weaknesses need to be addressed. We have absorbed lessons. We can learn them. We know that to properly address them will take time. It will take time to get this right, to raise and properly train new units, to time to decide what equipment to produce that equipment, to then rehearse the attack, to move the equipment to the front lines, and then finally, after all of that, the attack will be launched. And so we will just have to wait. As frustrating as that possibly is for us, we will just have to wait. Because what absolutely cannot happen is we cannot repeat the First World War. We cannot go back to the Sama Ypres. In that war, the idiots in command of the troops learned nothing from failure, learned none of the weaknesses that should be fixed, and every few months they followed the same plans from the previous attack and just threw their men at the same objectives as last time. Tens of thousands died, and for what? A few meters of muddy, bloody trenches. Do we want another Verdun? Do we want another Somme or Ypres? I know that this may not have been the most optimistic episode, for many weaknesses in the Ukrainian army have been revealed, weaknesses that we all wish did not exist. I know personally that in June my hopes were far higher. I had hoped to start this picture with a picture of the blue and yellow flag over Mariupol. But what we want is not always what we are going to get. It turns out that tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but this will just make our triumph all the more sweeter when it finally comes. Because to close, finally, on a hopeful note, I remain confident that a proper resourced offensive, led by properly trained soldiers, can break the Surovikin line. And so with any luck, Kyiv and Washington will take that lesson, act on it, and go forth to victory. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you all again next week.